In 1930s Cleveland, smoke covered the skyline, but something far darker moved beneath it. Kingsbury Run was where the city's forgotten people slept, disappeared, and sometimes were never named again. At first, the papers treated it like another violent headline. Then the pattern began to breathe. The first scenes gave detectives something worse than evidence: the sense that this killer understood concealment. This was not a robbery, not a drunken fight, and not the kind of violence Cleveland knew how to explain. The killer's victims were often poor, transient, and invisible, which made justice harder before it even began. The nickname sold newspapers, but it also hid the victims behind a monster's title. Fear spread through Cleveland, not because one person vanished, but because anyone forgotten could be next. Edward Andrassy had a name, a face, and a life before the case turned him into evidence. A name helped investigators, but it also made the unnamed victims feel even more abandoned. Florence Polillo's life was complicated, but her death deserved more than gossip and suspicion. By then, the map no longer showed separate crimes. It showed a mind returning to familiar ground. At night, Kingsbury Run became a place where witnesses saw shadows and learned not to ask questions. The killer's greatest cover was not darkness alone. It was a city trained to ignore its poorest people. Eliot Ness had beaten gangsters before, but this enemy left no face to confront. The wounds suggested control, patience, and knowledge that made investigators quietly fear a skilled hand. If the killer had anatomical knowledge, the suspect pool suddenly became smaller, stranger, and more dangerous. One theory pointed toward a doctor, but suspicion is only a shadow until evidence gives it weight. The tattooed man carried markings meant to identify him, yet even those could not return his name. Police asked the public for names, but the city answered mostly with rumors and silence. Then Lake Erie entered the case, returning pieces of the mystery, without returning the truth. The killer used the city's geography like a weapon: gullies, rivers, bridges, and forgotten ground. The press demanded certainty, but the evidence gave police only fragments and humiliation. For Ness, every new victim was not only a tragedy, but a public failure with his name attached. Witnesses existed, but fear, hunger, and mistrust made every answer difficult to believe. The killer may have walked among them often, familiar enough to be ignored until it was too late. Without names, investigators could not build histories. Without histories, motives stayed locked behind blank files. Every promising lead seemed to collapse under one missing witness, one bad memory, or one impossible timeline. The murders changed ordinary habits. Doors were checked twice, and every stranger carried a question. Cleveland wanted safety, newspapers wanted answers, and politicians wanted the nightmare removed from their doorstep. Hyper-realistic, 8K cinematic lighting, shot on 35mm lens, noir thriller atmosphere. Another file without a name meant another life reduced to location, date, and condition. Sweeney's background made him interesting to investigators, but interest could not become a courtroom conviction. In the interrogation room, suspicion had a face, but the case still lacked the proof to hold it. Ness may have believed he was close, but belief is dangerous when evidence refuses to follow. The man some feared most could not be publicly named as the killer, and that made him more haunting. Frank Dolezal entered the case as a suspect, but his story would become another unresolved wound. His confession sounded like progress, until questions around pressure, truth, and fear began to poison it. Dolezal died before the truth could be tested, leaving suspicion pointed in every direction at once. The investigation had suspects, theories, and headlines, but none of them could carry the whole truth. Ness tried to cleanse the killing ground, but fire could not burn away what police still did not know. The crackdown displaced the living, while the dead still waited for names, answers, and justice. The killing seemed to stop, but stopping is not the same as solving. Maybe the killer died, moved away, or simply found a new place where nobody knew his shadow. The case remained behind in boxes, but every closed file still seemed to breathe. The fires changed the landscape, but they did not tell police whose shadow had been moving through it. People who had almost nothing lost even that, while the killer remained untouched by the flames. Merylo knew the streets had changed, but the silence around the murders felt exactly the same. The reports became precise, clinical, and unbearable, describing damage without explaining the person behind it. The public wanted a monster with a name, because fear without a name spreads everywhere. Then came words that felt less like evidence, and more like someone enjoying the city's panic. If the letters were real, the killer was no longer hiding only bodies, but playing with attention. Every message had to be tested carefully, because panic often writes in the killer's handwriting. Sweeney stayed in the margins of the case, close enough to disturb, distant enough to survive accusation. Tests and questions could suggest danger, but the law required something firmer than unease. Ness could pressure the city, raid the streets, and face cameras, but he could not force proof to appear. Dolezal's words seemed to offer closure, until the circumstances around those words became impossible to ignore. It cracked under details that refused to line up. Before a courtroom could test his story, Dolezal died, and another door closed without answering anything. His death became its own mystery, feeding doubts about whether police had found truth or simply pressure. The investigation had too many pieces and no center strong enough to hold them together. The unknown victims haunted the story hardest, because even their own names had been stolen. Even markings meant to make a person recognizable failed against distance, poverty, and time. Merylo searched bars, shelters, and back rooms, places where truth usually arrived bruised and unreliable. Every whisper sounded useful until it met the hard edges of dates, names, and impossible proof. If the killer had a room, it may have looked ordinary enough for nobody to remember. The most frightening possibility was not chaos, but someone careful enough to cleanly return to normal life. Sweeney's knowledge remained disturbing, but knowledge alone could not prove what happened in the dark. To Ness, the answer may have walked away in plain sight, protected by uncertainty. The newspapers that once amplified fear now sharpened it into blame. From City Hall, the case was no longer hidden in the Run. It stared back at power. The later discoveries felt like messages placed where the city could not pretend not to see. The killer seemed to understand spectacle, placing fear where authority could feel personally challenged. The evidence showed pattern, skill, and repetition, but never the one detail that became a name. Dates could be listed, places could be circled, but motive kept slipping through every line. Even families far from Kingsbury Run began feeling the case inside their own locked rooms. The Run was cleared, but clearing poverty did not mean protecting people from what had hunted them. Then the murders stopped, or seemed to, which created one last question police could not control. Did he leave Cleveland by rail, carrying his secret into another city before anyone understood? Did he die quietly, leaving the case to end not with justice, but with biology? Or did he remain nearby, aging into the background while the city turned him into legend? Ness had built a reputation on catching criminals, but this case left a shadow across his name. Merylo kept chasing fragments, because sometimes persistence is all an unsolved case leaves behind. The final columns could not name the killer, so they tried to return dignity to the dead. The unidentified victims entered the archives, but archives are not graves, and paperwork is not peace. Decades later, strangers still reopen the case, hoping technology can hear what history missed. Modern science may restore names, even if it never restores the moment justice was lost. The victims may someday regain names, but the killer may keep his forever hidden. Kingsbury Run looks quieter now, but quiet places can carry the loudest unfinished histories. The question is not only who he was, but how many people looked straight past him. Long after the last official lead faded, the case kept finding new eyes willing to stare back. The hardest files were not the thick ones, but the ones where a name should have been. Cleveland moved forward, but some places do not forget what was left beneath their roads. Science may still return names to victims, even if justice remains permanently out of reach. The pattern was visible enough to terrify, but never clear enough to identify the man behind it. Sweeney remained the kind of suspect true crime remembers carefully: disturbing, plausible, and legally unproven. Ness may have had a belief, but history cannot convict a man on belief alone. Dolezal's confession promised an ending, then collapsed into questions about pressure, fear, and truth. A dead suspect can quiet a case, but silence is not the same as proof. The killer always seemed one street ahead, close enough to fear, too distant to name. Fear does not always make people look closer. Sometimes it teaches them to look away. Witnesses moved, forgot, died, or changed their stories, and the case lost voices it needed. The evidence spoke in details, but none of those details ever formed a complete sentence. Close-up on her pencil crossing out cold language. Lighting, warm desk lamp with newsroom shadows. Details, typewriter, victim sketches, coffee cup, cigarette smoke, rain-streaked window, empty newsroom desks. Quality, hyper-realistic, 8K, cinematic lighting, shot on 35mm lens, noir thriller atmosphere. N-word story did not begin at a crime scene. It began as a life moving through hardship. Florence deserved more than rumors, more than judgment, and more than a place in a killer's pattern. Behind every file was a person someone may have missed before the killer ever arrived. The killer exploited bodies, but the city's neglect had already made those lives dangerously easy to lose. The nickname made the killer unforgettable, but it risked making the victims disappear twice. To understand the case honestly, the victims must stand in the center, not the killer. When the pattern stopped, detectives had no confession, no trial, and no reason they could trust. A city can feel safer after murders stop, but safety built on ignorance is fragile. Maybe he left by train, carrying his secret into another city before Cleveland understood. Maybe he died quietly, and the truth disappeared with a name nobody thought to check. Or maybe he stayed close enough to hear people whisper about him over breakfast. Was the killer trained, experienced, or simply practiced through violence nobody connected in time? The victims still ask a simpler question first. Who were we before someone erased us? The case showed the limits of power when evidence, poverty, and fear all worked against certainty. Memory kept the murders alive, but memory can preserve pain without delivering answers. The one person investigators needed most never sat long enough in the chair. Putting a case into storage can protect paper, but it cannot bury what remains unfinished. The city changed, the skyline changed, but the unanswered questions stayed under the bridges. The victims cannot speak now, but the silence around them still demands careful listening. Suspects remained, but none became the final answer history could safely hold. Even motives stayed unstable, shifting between madness, opportunity, skill, and something never understood. Kingsbury Run was the center, but the full truth may have lived somewhere beyond it. The killer targeted people the city already struggled to see, and that failure helped the mystery grow. A name is more than identification. It is the first piece of dignity a victim is owed. He does not deserve legend, only the unanswered responsibility history could never place in handcuffs. There was no conviction, no final courtroom, and no moment where Cleveland could exhale. The final headline was not an ending. It was simply the point where newspapers moved on. The trains kept moving over Kingsbury Run, as if history beneath them weighed nothing at all. Somewhere, there may have been a room that held answers no detective ever entered. The doctor theory remains compelling, because it answers some questions while leaving the largest one untouched. The false confession theory reminds us that desperate investigators can create noise that sounds like truth. The stranger theory is terrifying because a man without roots can vanish before suspicion grows. The local theory is worse. Maybe people saw him often and never knew what he carried. The strongest theories explain parts of the case, but none explain all of it cleanly. Every cold case carries the same ache. The answer may have been missed when it was fresh. Evidence lost to time does not only weaken a case, it changes what justice can become. What remains is imperfect, but imperfect records are still better than silence. So which theory fits best? The doctor, the stranger, the local, or someone never named? Kingsbury Run no longer looks the same, but some silences survive every change a city makes. The killer disappeared without a trial, leaving Cleveland with fear, fragments, and a faceless shadow. He was called the Mad Butcher, but the name that mattered most was never found.